Tonight on Gloomstation, I'm going to share with you 3 October stories. Ghosts, devils, and the scariest thing of them all, humans. You see, it's not always about jump scares and nightmare imagery. Sometimes it's just about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So dim the lights, find somewhere safe, and listen. This story was told to me by a family friend some years ago. This is how his story goes. I was working as a roofer back in the 80s. It was good money and I was good at it. The work brought me all around the tri-state area, so I experienced all sort of things I wouldn't normally encounter in my hometown. Being a construction guy during the 80s meant there was always work, and the more work I had, the more I was able to go out and do. I was staying at a cheap motel for a few weeks, but back then even the cheap motels were shiny and new. It had air conditioning and a television, so I had no complaints. Every morning before work, I'd go to a diner and have a large breakfast. And every night after work, I'd stop by the same diner and grab dinner. I started to know the staff. It became a regular. One night, right before it closed, a waitress invited me to a party. She said it was a bonfire in the woods. I had nothing else to do except go back to my room and sleep, so I decided to join her. I took my truck and followed her. Now back then, we didn't have cell phones, so I couldn't call her and ask how much further I'd have to follow. I couldn't ask where she was leading me to. Back then, we just went with the flow. We drove for maybe 20 minutes until we were pretty deep into the woods. Right when I started to question what I had gotten myself into, I started to see light ahead. Not streetlights or anything, but the orange and red glow of a large fire. Dozens of shadows moved about and I could hear music ahead. I was a bit relieved, but more so excited. There had to be 30 people here dancing around a large bonfire with pallets stacked up. She parked, and I parked beside her. When we got out, she looked excited. "You ready to have some fun?" She asked me like I was going to say no, like I would shrug and drive 20 minutes back to my motel. No, I was there to party, and that's what we did. We jumped right in and joined in the dancing. Remember, this was the 80s, so everyone there was wearing either denim or leather, and everyone had a red cup in their hands. The more we danced and drank, the more I let loose. I couldn't tell you how long it lasted, but somehow the music turned down. The fire got a little smaller, and everyone went from dancing to standing around the fire quietly. The waitress brought me another drink, which I took without hesitation. It was sweet. I was so many cups in that it didn't raise any alarms. I just figured I couldn't taste the alcohol anymore. But that drink slammed me back to sobriety. It was like a switch from loose and dizzy to straight and sharp. But the fire still kept my attention. I remember staring into the flames, just sort of zoning out. The waitress was hanging on me, her head on my shoulder, her hand on my chest, and she too was just looking into the fire. I blinked, and she was standing in front of me holding a book in her hands. It didn't have a title, or if it did, I don't remember it. I don't think I had a choice, so for whatever reason I opened the front cover, and I do remember what it said. "Whosoever chooses to read beyond this page shall be condemned to hell." It sent chills through me. I looked up at the waitress and she was just staring at me, smiling, waiting for me to turn the page. Honestly, part of me wanted to, just out of morbid curiosity, but another part of me screamed not to. It begged me not to. Did I believe in heaven or hell before this? Honestly, no. So it wasn't some lifelong devotion that kept me from turning the page. It was something else. I felt sick, uneasy. It was just a book, just paper and ink. But the warning, it felt like I had just read a sign that said, "Danger. One more step will activate a nuke." I held it in shaky hands, wishing I was drunk again, but like I said, I was absolutely sober now. I knew without a doubt that there was a battle raging inside me. All I had to do was turn the page and the battle would be over. I looked up at the waitress again and asked, "What is this? What's happening to me?" She put a hand on my shoulder, leaned in and whispered, "Open it. See what we see." When she leaned in, she was no longer blocking the view of the fire. I looked past her into the flames, and I swear to God, I saw the devil. The flames were moving as flames do, but in the fire itself was a face with red eyes looking back at me. I don't know how long ago the music had stopped, but all I could hear now was their chanting. The people stood around the fire repeating some phrase or spell or something. I looked down at my hands. In one I held this book, and the other a cup. I dropped them both and took a step back away from the fire. "What are you doing?" she asked me. I didn't say anything back. I nearly ran to my truck. I half expected someone to try and stop me, but they didn't. I turned the key and hit the gas. I immediately felt better. I felt relieved. I felt like the war inside me was over. For 20 minutes of driving, I thought about what I had just seen. It was a ritual or something. The drinking, the music, the dancing. It was all meant to lure me in, and if I had been drunk, it might have worked. But the drink they gave me at the end served its purpose. It cleared my head so that I could make the choice. You see, it needed me to choose to turn that page, to choose the thing in the fire. I never returned to that diner. When the job was done, I actually refused to work in that area again. Some people don't believe me, and that's fine. But I'll tell you this, when the battle for your soul happens, you'll know it. And you'll have a choice to make, just like I did, all those years ago at the fire in the woods. This is my own story from about 10 years ago. A friend of mine had just moved into a studio apartment. It was on the 3rd floor of a commercial building that used the first 2 floors for businesses, and the top 2 for apartments. Now this might sound common for some of you, but in my area, it's the only building like this, and nobody in the friend group even knew the building rented apartments. So my friend Max invites our friend group of 5 over to check out the building and see what a studio apartment is like. We first noticed that the hallway carpet is brand new. The walls are freshly painted and the place as a whole looked amazing. As we're walking down the hall taking it all in, a guy, maybe in his mid-30s, comes around the corner and says hello. Oddly enough, he asks us for help bringing a refrigerator up the stairs. It turns out the guy owns the building, and he's in the process of updating the rooms. We agree to help him and make short work of it while he tells us about the building. He tells us the 3rd floor is nearly done being renovated, and right now he only has the 3 tenants. My friend, an old woman who lived in an interior apartment with no windows, and a girl that was hardly ever home. All of them live on the 3rd floor, and he won't start working on the currently empty 4th floor until all 6 rooms on the 3rd are done being updated. He tells us the 4th floor is in such bad shape that he can't rent out any of the units, and the cost to renovate them right now would be insane. So, it would sit empty, awaiting the care it needed to become habitable. We eventually get to Max's studio, and we're completely blown away by the modern look that's unlike anything we've seen in our town. It was about 7 p.m. and one of my friends suggests we look around the building some more. The problem is, the only thing we haven't seen yet is the 4th floor. The stairwell to the 4th is blocked off by a large sheet of plywood, and the elevator button doesn't do anything for that floor. We thought our adventure was over before it could even begin. But after just a little bit of exploring, we found the door to the emergency stairwell leading down to the ground floor, and up to the 4th. The spiral stairwell is pitch black and narrow. With our phone lights, we can see that webs clung to nearly every surface, and the already low ceiling was made more daunting by the countless spiders surprised by our intrusion. It didn't help that one of our friends is a severe arachnophobe, and he made it clear that he couldn't be in that small space for long. Going single file up the stairs was difficult and slow. One at a time, we exited the tiny closet that served as a stairwell, and found ourselves on the 4th floor. Compared to the elegance and beauty of the 3rd floor, this was a nightmare. The smell was mildewy and stale. We could see just enough with our phone lights to learn that the overhead lights would be no use, even if we found a switch. They were fluorescent tube lights that actually dangled from wires or were missing entirely. Of the 6 of us, 3 immediately decided to go back to the 3rd floor and wait. They were the cowards, the unadventurous. They were the smart ones, because all of us should have gone back together. But instead, the 3 of us that stayed laughed at them and headed slowly down the hall. We hoped to find an empty apartment and see what they looked like before the renovations. We passed room 40 and tried the handle. It was locked. So were 41 and 42. But when I tried the handle of room 43, it actually turned. I looked back and my 2 friends were as excited as I was to see inside. I slowly pushed the door open and made a long, drawn-out whine. I shined my light ahead and saw a large patchwork blanket strung up directly ahead, blocking the view entirely. Fueled by youthful curiosity, I carefully reached a hand up to the blanket. That's when I felt a soft tap on my shoulder. I looked back to see one of my friends with his finger to his mouth. Then he whispered, "Do you hear that?" I paused, and for the first time I did hear something. The steady sound of wind, maybe? Or a strange, endless hum. I nodded, then turned back and slowly moved the blanket away. On the other side, from the floor to the ceiling, were VHS tapes. So many of them that the more I pulled the blanket away, the more there were. Small stacks on the ground, piles to the sides. The sound was louder now that the blanket was moved, but ahead of me was yet another patchy blanket strung up the same way. I was getting a little shaky now, and sweating. I reached up again and began to pull the second blanket back. As I did, the sound became louder and it was clear what it was. Static from a television. The more I pulled back, the more the white glow of the static lit up the area of the door we were standing in. The blanket was far enough back that we could see the VHS tapes never ended. They were everywhere. And at the center of the room was a recliner chair leaned back with the leg rest up. Someone was in that chair. As soon as I realized it, I knew we needed to leave. We needed to get out of there quickly and quietly. I turned back and whispered, "Go." What I hadn't thought of, what I hadn't realized, was they couldn't see as much as I could. They couldn't see that someone was in the apartment. They had stood so close to each other behind me that when the second one turned, he bumped the third, which made him drop his phone. It hit the ground loud and hard. I heard the recliner's leg rest slam closed. At the same time, I heard a rough voice shout, "Who's there?" I screamed for my friends to run, and they did, but not before picking up his phone and blocking the way for just a second. I knew the man was going to grab me in that second. I knew he would reach me and yank me back inside. I could practically feel his fingers already touching the back of my neck. But finally, that second was over. The way was clear and we ran to the emergency exit stairwell. The three of us bolted back down the hall to the tiny closet that served as an emergency stairwell. And thank God it was there, because this was now an emergency. We barreled down the stairs, and suddenly, without warning, my body stopped. Then I felt my body falling before I felt the pain of my head colliding with the low ceiling we had ducked through all the way up, while we weren't being chased. It's true what they say, you see stars for a moment. Little dots of light flickered across my vision. But I knew I didn't have time to feel anything. So I picked myself up and kept going down the stairs, this time in an awkward, speeding crouch. I reached the floor below and opened the door to see my two friends a few feet ahead running past a very confused-looking elderly woman carrying some paper-bagged groceries. I heard the man barreling down the stairs and knew I'd never make it to my friend's apartment in time. So in a moment of genius or stupidity, I made a gamble. "Ma'am, can I help you with your groceries?" That was it. That was my grand plan. She looked down the hall where my friends had gone. She looked at the door I had just come through. Then she looked at me, while my heart plunged into my stomach with worry of what would happen. She was confused. She didn't know me. She didn't have a clue what was going to happen to me. But she handed me a bag. The timing could not have been more perfect, because the guy burst through the door and took 2 or 3 huge steps towards us. He was filthy. His clothes were stained and torn, but more than that, I could see the guy was a giant. He towered over the old lady and me. And while my head was throbbing, I was so glad I'd worn my hat so he couldn't see the huge egg on my forehead. He was so close I could smell him. He asked, "Were you just upstairs?" The way he looked at me was terrifying, but I had a part to play. "No, sir, I'm helping my grandma with groceries. I saw some kids run downstairs." The guy's chest was heaving, and I can only imagine how hard it had been for him to come down the stairway. He didn't say anything back. He looked toward the main stairs leading down, then huffed and went back to the emergency stairwell. I was safe. I made it out. "You must have really pissed him off," the old lady said. Then she started walking towards her door. I followed with the groceries in my hands. When I got back to the room and told the guys what had happened, they were shocked that it worked, baffled that the old lady helped me, and more than anything, they wanted to know if any of the rooms up there were occupied. I didn't want to know. I didn't care. That giant of a man could have ended me, just for being curious. This scared the hell out of me when I was a kid, and I've had to remember it every October since. I was young, maybe 13 or 14, and my parents let a few friends stay the night. We planned to play flashlight tag. Now, for those of you that don't know the rules, it's very simple. Everyone else hides, and the person who knows it gets to use their flashlight to find everyone. But anyone who makes it to the safe zone without being spotted, well, they're safe. It was dark and there was no moon, so it was the perfect setup for flashlight tag. I was it first since it was my house, and my friends disappeared into the backyard and woods. We all knew where the property line was since we had played in the area so much. I faced the house, closed my eyes, and counted to 50. The first thing I did was circle the house, and I immediately tagged 2 of my friends. With 3 left, I started moving towards the tree line. I was going to circle the shed first, then check inside, then work my way into the woods. When I approached the shed, I heard wood creak and knew someone was inside. I flung the door open and shined my light, but to my surprise there was nobody in there, so I closed the door and turned. That's when I saw the leg of someone sneaking around the back of the shed. I figured one of my friends were trying to play close to me so they could get to the safe zone without me seeing. I cut my light off and slowly started creeping around the other side of the shed. Each step made me more excited that I was going to catch someone. I got to the corner and knew they would have to be there, so in one big move I jumped out and shined my light behind the shed. I looked at the kid I caught, and my smile just disappeared. I had no idea who this kid was. He was wearing shorts and a striped t-shirt, while the rest of us were wearing jackets. He looked totally surprised by me and I was speechless because it seemed like my light went straight through him, and his eyes almost reflected my flashlight. He was as terrified as I was. I heard someone yell safe, and by reflex I looked back at the house. When I turned back, the kid was gone. No sound or anything. Just gone. I whipped the light around and looked for any sign of the kid, but there was nothing. It was like he had never been there at all. When I got back to the house with everyone, I told my friends what I saw, and of course nobody believed me. The next morning I told my dad, and I showed him exactly where the kid had been. My dad was taking it seriously, so he really looked. That's when he found something weird. He had to use his hands and pull up some grass along with a bit of dirt. Then he used his fingers to pry it up and out of the ground. What he found was a small old plastic flashlight with a cracked lens and a broken switch. We had never seen anything like that in our property. I remember my dad even asked around about old missing kids in the area, but nobody fit the description of the kid I had seen while playing flashlight tag. I'm 30 now, and to this day, whenever I'm using a flashlight at night, I expect to see that kid still playing the game. If you have true stories of your own that you'd like to be put in a future video, send them to my email listed below. Also, after liking and subscribing, tell me in the comments what your favorite story has been so far. Now that's it for tonight's episode. Stay safe out there.